Roy, what do you have to say as we get started tonight?
Well, welcome everybody. I think questions and answers is one of my favorite parts of apologetics. And we're doing this kind of one-to-many tonight. But my favorite thing is to sit down and have a conversation with someone who has a question. And to me, that's when my faith really comes alive. I think that's when all of the Bible studying and the verses that I've read and that I've studied before, really, I can start using that knowledge to help people. And so I wanted to start with a few verses today, for a few verses tonight that kind of, I think, capture the essence of Q&A, which is a big part of apologetics. So let me read you a few verses out of Colossians chapter 2, and then also Romans 12. He says, Paul says this, "In Christ, all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden. See to it then that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. Instead, let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think." And so a lot of apologetics is maturing in our Christian faith. When we accept Christ, we're literally made into a new person, and God uses the scriptures, and the Holy Spirit transforms the way we think. And as I explained in the conference, a lot of that, probably the biggest element of that, is to reject falsehood. And so hopefully you've had almost a month now to practice that. I would love to hear if any of you have examples of falsehoods that you've encountered in the last month as you have been looking for them, and what change that has made in your thinking and in your experience. If you go in, and you don't have to know all the answers, but if you just start rejecting the falsehoods, you'll be amazed at how much more clear reality is and how much everything makes sense. So with that, Brian, go ahead with your first question.
Thank you, Roy. And I understand that there were a handful of people that joined us a little late as we got started tonight. So want to re-welcome you if you joined us a little late, and want to remind you on how you can ask questions this evening. And I'm actually starting to see questions are already starting to roll in, which is great. If you want to ask a question, simply click on Ask a Question, the bottom of the screen on the chat. Simply click on Ask a Question, type in your question there. If you'd like to ask your question live tonight, simply put live in parentheses. We'll find you and we'll unmute you so you can ask Roy and Adrian your question this evening. So let's get started. Let's start really at the beginning as we talk about faith and foundational faith tonight. A question being, Roy, Adrian, do you ever doubt your own faith, and what do you do about it?
You want me to start, Adrian?
Go for it.
All right. So I would say, do I ever, I think you're, let me read back the question, Brian. Do you ever doubt your own faith? Is that what you said?
Yeah. And what do you do about it if you do?
I would say kind of. I would say, and you're probably going to hear this a lot, whoever asked this question. I'm going to really be a stickler for the wording of the question. And maybe even, hopefully, some of you guys can ask your question live so we can dialogue and really get to the answer. The question is, do I doubt my own faith? I would say I have doubts in my faith. Absolutely. I think everybody does. What do I do when I have doubts in my own faith? I ask God. I look for opportunities to study and research. As I've explained at the conference, Christianity is a thinking religion. I'm going to say that over and over and over tonight. Christianity is a thinking religion. The Bible absolutely rejects blind faith. Doubts are good because it drives you to an answer. So I would say I have doubts all the time, and there are opportunities for me to research, to ask God, to study the scriptures, to think logically and consistently. The second part of that, do I ever doubt my own faith? And I'm going to be honest here. I have, from the day I got saved, I have been challenging my faith with piercing questions. I want to know the truth. And so I would say, overall, I have not landed at a place where I doubt my faith, because every time I've had a doubt, I've searched the scriptures, I've asked God, I've talked to other people, I've thought logically and consistently, and I have found the Bible and God to be true and to have a satisfying answer. So I can honestly say, no, I don't doubt my faith in general, but I do have doubts all the time.
Let me jump in on that as well. First off, thank you for putting this on, guys. This is fantastic. So I'm happy to be here. I actually gave a talk recently specifically about this sort of idea of doubting. And actually, it's funny because I went through a period of life where I did have more doubts, and it's kind of what Roy said. As I worked my way through them, I found that I was given answers, good answers, solid answers. Because I believe Christianity is true, I believe that when we have doubts, we can, in most cases, find answers. Now, having said that, I don't have answers to everything yet. There are things that if you were to ask me tonight, I would give you an answer that would be, I fully admit, only so-so. There's a small number of issues where I still feel like, I got only so-so answers. In the vast majority of things, I've been given very good answers. And there's one other thing as far as what to do with them, because doubts are not just for us. Doubts are for anybody, any worldview should have doubts. In fact, this is what keeps me strong in my faith isn't just the answers and my personal experience with Jesus Christ, but also the amount of doubts I would have if I left the faith. So if I left Christianity, what would I be? Let's say I'm an atheist. Well, the amount of doubts I would have about atheism are mountains compared to the little issues that I may have with Christianity. I mean, we're talking about everything coming from nothing. Morality doesn't exist. The fine tuning of the universe was just simply random chance, even though there's a trillion to one odds against it. We have no free will. Everything can't, again, there's a mountain of issues that the other side has. So when I'm confronted with my doubts, it may be a verse that doesn't make sense, that seems a little out of place in the Bible, and I think, oh man, what if I never come to an answer for this? Okay, I have to, on some level, I have to live with that little bit of unanswered question, because the alternative is I then have to accept all these other issues that are so massive compared to this little one verse problem I might have. So that's kind of, I guess, the answer to the question of what I do with it. I recognize the fact that the other side should have so much more doubts involved than what I'm living with right now. So to answer the question, I actually don't really have that struggling doubt anymore that I used to have, simply because of that.
Awesome. And I appreciate, I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone, both of your transparency, and I'm sure we'll see more of that, hear more of that throughout the night. More than 40 folks are joining us live right now, and so thanks to all of you for being with us this evening. Vic is checking in with a question, and the question is this: we live in a post-truth culture. So what strategies would you recommend when advocating for truth when someone is more emotionally based in their thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question, Vic. And just to remind me, Brian, is this, do people have the ability to ask their questions live if they want?
Yes, this was not listed as a live question.
Okay. And then if they miss that and we start answering the question, is there a way for them to say, let's say Vic says, hey, I understand, great, or good intro, Roy, but you missed the point of my question. I want to ask again. How would they?
They'll just ask a question and we can clarify it.
Clarify. Okay.
Yep.
Sounds good. So I would say, Vic, so every single day, I'm an engineer during the day. So I look through a scanning electron microscope. I pull out the periodic table. I run experiments. I cannot get away with living like there's no truth in my day-to-day job. I would absolutely fail within, 10 minutes. And so what I would do is, if people start to say, you know what, I don't believe in truth, everything is emotion, my emotions are true. If I feel that it's true, it is true. I would just start by asking them questions and use whatever circumstances are in front of you. At my job, it's a chemical experiment or whatever it is. It might just be some reality with your friend or your family. I would just start gently, respectfully asking questions. And what you will find, and everyone will find, is that you cannot live as if there's no truth. It's just an unsustainable worldview. And so you don't have to jump into all the philosophy. You don't have to go 10 levels deep on, postmodernism and all this kind of stuff. You can just ask a very simple question to show that living as if there is no truth just contradicts itself immediately. And you can't live like that.
I'm going to second that, because you'll find that what people say doesn't match what they're arguing for. So if I had a conversation with I'm also an engineer by training as well, and at work I had a technician who was a super smart guy, and he knew I was a Christian, and so him and I, we got along really well. We would rib each other. We had a good time. And one day he says, "Hey, listen, you guys are great. Christians are great. I've got neighbors that are Christians. You guys are all wonderful and all that." He's not a Christian, and he said, "But one of the things that bothers me is that you guys kind of have this idea that you're right and everyone else is wrong." And I said, "Okay, well, what do you mean by that?" Well, he said, "Can't there be more than one truth? I mean, you guys have this notion that you're right, and it seems kind of arrogant to go around telling people they're right, that you're right and everyone else is wrong." And I said, "Well, okay, I'm sorry that comes across arrogant. I hope I don't come across arrogant. But let me ask you a question. Do you think I'm wrong for doing that?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, why is it that when I think that I'm right and other people are wrong, that's arrogant? But when you tell me I'm wrong, I'm just wrong, and that your particular viewpoint is correct?" And he kind of took a step back and said, "Oh, no, that's not what I meant. What I really meant was it's kind of it's wrong to just." Oh, and he goes, "Man, I'm all confused now." and he admitted to me. He goes, "Man, listen, I get what you're saying. You're right. You can have an opinion there." And so he kind of came around to this idea that we all actually have a notion of what we think is right. Otherwise, we would think that was wrong and something else was correct. So we all have this notion that this truth exists, and that we can't have multiple truths or multiple ways of being correct in opposition to each other. And whenever someone says there's this idea there's no truth, in a way that is a contradiction in itself. I mean, they're basically making the statement that it is true that there is no truth. And obviously that's a self-defeating statement. So again, most people who will say this will immediately turn around and start proclaiming certain things as true. Donald Trump is evil. Abortion, pro-life people are want to control women. They give certain truths out there that they believe strongly, and yet will very readily say there is no truth. There is no solid foundation there. So it's more easy to pick on, to hear the things they're saying and catch them when they are proclaiming truths, than it is to voice this idea sometimes.
Before we dive into some heavy questions, I want to ask, and Adrian, being a former teacher for a decade or so, the question came up: and this quite simply, should I keep my children in public school?
Yeah. So I used to be a public school teacher, and I taught at the middle school and high school level. And I remember when I taught, I taught in kind of a rough school in the Denver area. And I remember thinking, boy, if all public schools are like this, there's no way. Because there was just so many problems within the school I was teaching in. I wouldn't want my kids to be in this environment. But then I taught at another school, actually in Battleground, and the environment was much nicer. And so for a while, that question was kind of a toss-up for me. Okay, do I want my kids in public school or not? Now I have kids. I have 4 kids of my own, and they're all in school. And this question became very real to me. My kids right now are in a public school. And so the answer to that question is actually no, do not put your kids in public school unless you're willing to do something. And this is going to be where the big caveat is. Right now, my kids are doing school from home. And so they're doing online classes through Zoom with their teachers. A couple months ago, I sat with one of my kids as they went through their humanities class. And their humanities teacher began to teach the most radical form of leftist activism I've ever heard from any public school teaching. And I looked at my daughter who was in this class and said, is this typical? I mean, is this what the teacher says? Yeah, she does this all the time. She got on about also, again, I'm not going to cover all the topics she did, but she was just teaching the kids, basically indoctrinating my kid in my own house in the most radical activism that you could hear. And so,
what grade, Adrian?
She's in 6th grade, and introduced topics that we hadn't prepared her for, because they seemed a little more advanced. I mean, I want to teach my kids these subjects, but she just, blew the door right open and said, here's how these things are. And basically, it was 1 hour of indoctrination to my kid. I was livid. And so we actually went through I emailed the principal, emailed the teachers, kind of went back and forth with them, and realized that the only reason I was able to catch this was because my kids are at home right now. If they had been in school, they would have been at school behind closed doors. I would have not had a chance to hear any of this. And my kids would have come home with ideas that were exactly the opposite of what I've been trying to teach them at home. And so right now I kind of view this as a bit of a blessing in disguise, because I'm able to work with them on the things that they're hearing, because they will hear this whether or not they're in public school or Christian school, because eventually they'll encounter these ideas. So the answer for us is, we realize how this is going to be an issue. So we're most likely going to, again, from our point of view, we're probably going to put them back into some form of Christian school, homeschool, something, because I can't send my 11-year-old off to go get indoctrinated at a school where this teacher thinks it's her goal in life to indoctrinate my kids. It will happen. It happens all the time. So right now it's working for us because we're able to be in there, listening to their classes, be involved, and it's helpful. But boy, it's bad out there. It's really bad.
So I want to just make sure what's the asterisk again? So if someone's listening and they're like, put your kids in public school if
you are able to be well on top of everything they're learning. And I'm not talking about in just one class. I'm talking all the classes. This was in humanities that they were being taught this, but my 4th grader in their music class began to get same kinds of activist indoctrination. So it was just, you've got to be on top of it big time. Otherwise your kids are going to get all sorts of stuff that you're not realizing they're learning, and you can't counteract.
Roy, anything for that?
I was just going to say, Brian, you said eventually we'll get to some heavy topics.
That's funny.
That seemed pretty heavy.
Okay, so again, want to remind you, if you're just joining us tonight, that we are going to depend on you for live questions. whether it's typed in the chat or if you'd like to ask your question live, go ahead and type that question in to ask a question. And if you want to ask it live, we'd love to have you join the conversation with Roy and Adrian. A question, I think we've got a live one coming up, but a question would be, I think a lot of Christians were hoping, maybe thinking that post-election things would settle down. The question being, what is a Christian to do in the election, in this post-election cycle, as to where we are, not getting into the political side of it, but what is a Christian to do in the political phase of where we're at right now?
So I would say it's the same thing that you should always do, which is be a proponent of truth, always in every situation. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. And these aren't meant to be political or controversial, whatever, they're just factual. So in the beginning of the coronavirus, all these things came out, and it was like, you absolutely have to wear a mask. And then a week later, it was like, don't wear masks. If you're healthy, don't wear masks. It's bad for you. And then it was children aren't carriers of the virus. And then later it was like, no, children are carriers of the virus, and never shut down schools, and then shut down schools. And it was just all over the place. And so I think it's very easy to get caught up in whatever the latest, Trump won, no Biden won, no Trump's, looking for every vote, or whatever it is. I mean, there's 1,000 different things, and it changes every day. I would just try and be a kind of a force for truth. And so I think you can always find a situation where you try and calmly point out inconsistencies in the conversation, contradictions in the logic that people are using, manipulation, lies, falsehoods. I think in every situation, Christians can just pursue truth, and not only truth as a end, but a method. And so, it's, and again, as an example, either Trump or Biden won. That's that is a truth that's going to come out at some point. But you in the meantime, you can say, in the meantime, how can we pursue truth in the process, in the method, and not just sit around and wait for somebody's truth to be spun? That's what I would say.
I guess I could add one little thing, and that's one of the reasons we sometimes as Christians feel like the world is spinning out of control is because it seems like the other side sometimes has the high ground politically and actively on the ground, and I think we've kind of ceded that to the other side. We have families, we have jobs, we have lives that are revolve around church, and that makes us very, very busy, and we do a lot of good things. But as a result, when things go not our way, we don't have the mechanisms and the kinds of people and to be involved in the ways that make a difference politically. And so this is something that my eyes have been open to only recently, realizing, man, if I disagree with something, I see that, or I see the other side, thousands of people mobilize and make things happen for their particular point of view. My side doesn't do that. Now, I wouldn't advocate going to smash windows, but finding some amount of something to get involved in, finding that thing that is yours, that you say, okay, I'm going to be active in this one area. I'm watching my wife start to become more politically active in ways that I can appreciate, because I see her. We got 4 kids. She's got a business. We've got all these things going on, and yet you can't let your country go to, in a direction that you don't want. So finding ways to become active. She's finding ways to write letters to local politicians, get involved, calling businesses, seeing how she can help during these tough times. So things are kind of crazy right now, and so just we don't need super activists. We need 1,000 people who are a little bit active, and then we'll see things happen. That's what I'm starting to see.
Cool. Paul, we're going to get to your question in just a moment, but since we're talking about truth, I want to ask a question to you, and it's a little long, so hang in there with me. The question is, how do we balance arguments based on personal experience with truth when their experience is not based on the truth? And at times when people have represented a Christian perspective and have damaged the name of Christ and not lived out the truth of Scripture. So how do you balance arguments based on personal experience when truth is not their truth?
Did you catch that, Adrian?
Yeah, kind of. So it's a little bit confusing. So it sounds like what the question is: how do you balance a certain amount of truth with somebody's experience that seems to be different or negative with regard to Christianity?
Brian, did you say that this one could potentially be a live question or no?
No, that's coming up next.
Okay. Oh, I see a couple of people waving their hand. Oh, I don't know. Is that Catherine? Are you saying that was yours? Do you want to ask it live or no? So Brian, yeah, there we go. There you go, Catherine. Can you talk now?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Hey, it's Catherine.
Yeah. Hey.
Hi, Catherine. Haven't seen you in like 5 years.
I know, you guys. Hi, Southwest Hills people. So I run into arguments all the time with people from just so many different perspectives. I'm from inner city Houston, so I have a very diverse friend base, I would say. And so I'm exposed to a lot of different experiences and arguments constantly, which I appreciate because it helps me to sharpen my faith and it helps me to build my own faith. But a lot of times I feel like people present things to me as far as their personal experience, and they present it as if there just can be no other answer because this is what they've lived through. And in my attempts to say, like, that's a fallacy in argument, first of all, it's I can't remember the word for it, but it's not how you base your argument. Anyway, that kind of sounds derogatory to come across at that level and say, well, that's just one person's experience. But with issues dealing with some aggressive things that Christians represent, like Adrian, you brought up like pro-life movement, like, sometimes we as Christians haven't done a good job of being gentle and being kind and, expressing our views while passionate in a kind of loving way. And so they've had terrible, awful experiences with Christians and with our expression of truth in their lives. And so I was just wondering, how do you argue with that? I mean, how do you say, well, I'm sorry that happened, but you're wrong, it's just really hard to come across and say, well, let me break it down for you. And anyways, is that?
Yeah, actually, I love that question because what's funny is though, you're asking a bunch of people who are into apologetics. And so you're right. My immediate thought was, well, that is a non sequitur. And I want to go into the philosophical reasons why some guy's negative experience doesn't change the truth of what the reality is. This actually happened to a guy who I was speaking to at work who said he used to be a Christian. And I said, well, why did you leave? And he said, well, because my uncle is a pastor and I went to his church and he ended up cheating on his wife with someone in the church and the whole church kind of fell apart. And I left the church because all these people were hypocrites and now I'm not a Christian anymore. And I thought, that's horrible. But what does that have to do with whether or not, God is real and Christianity is true? I mean, none of that has anything to do with these things. So your question is I think it's so incredibly applicable because most people I've run into don't leave the faith because of, this powerful argument that they couldn't answer, but because some schmuck treated them poorly.
Yeah.
So Catherine, I would answer it this way, and I may end up kind of taking this in the wrong direction. So reel me back in if if you're like, no, that's not what I was asking. But what I have found is that there's two kinds of questions people normally ask. They either ask a truth question or they ask an emotion question.
Okay.
And if we ask an emotion, if they ask an emotion question and we give a truth answer, it's terrible. Like, even if you give the right truth answer, it's terrible because you missed the question. And if they ask a truth question and we give an emotion answer, it's the same thing. Even if it's a good even if, let's say somebody asks you a truth question and you respond in gentleness and kindness and love and all the right Christian things, but they were like, that's great, you're a wonderful person, but I asked the truth question. Can we just get to the truth? So it can be just as bad if you so I would say the most important thing as apologetics, as Christians, is you have to listen to the question that people are asking. So I'm going to assume for a minute that the person that you said, hey, I had a terrible experience because, I was at an abortion clinic and people were out there yelling that I was a murderer and I should be put to death, or, whatever it was. And it made me feel horrible. And why do Christians do that? At that point, you're in an emotional conversation. So it's not your job to say, well, wait a minute, is it a baby? Is it a fetus? Is it they're like, that's not what I'm asking right now. I'm asking you to be sympathetic and empathetic and to agree with me that, the way that Christian acted was not representative of God, right? Right. Okay. That, was that person representing the love of God? And again, I'm making all kinds of speculations and wild, assumptions here. But the point is, when somebody asks you a question, you need to stop whatever you're doing. You need to focus in and be like, is this an emotional question? Are they looking for an emotional conversation, or are they looking for a truth conversation? And if they're not looking for a truth conversation, unless you are absolutely filled with the Holy Spirit and you know exactly that this is what God is calling you to do, be very, very careful to not say, well, you know what, thank you for trusting me and asking me an emotional question and reaching out to me as a person, but you know what, I got a big Bible and I need to thump you right now. That, be very, very careful of that. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us live. That's cool. If you want to ask a live question, again, don't forget, just indicate that in the ask a question chat. Real quickly, I promise, Paul, we're coming to your question in just a moment. But real quick, Adrian, want to toss it back to you because you've teased us a little bit on what your kids were being taught. And so maybe just in like a 2-minute nutshell, the question is, we want to know what's being taught to Adrian's kids. What do we need to be concerned about? It seems like this is relevant to apologetics and truth. So you're on the clock, 2 minutes. What should we as parents be aware of?
Sure. So as part of the, that's so funny. As part of the Oregon State curriculum, they're requested, the schools are requested to teach social justice topics, so anti-racism, things like that. And so this particular class was about the current Black Lives Matter movement in Portland, and where the problems were for me was that the material was presented in such a way that was of an activist nature. So if I were to say, here's a neutral point of view or an informational point of view, it'd be Black Lives Matter is a movement that is protesting police brutality and so on. Here's their points. Here's the points of the other side. Some say that the police are being too brutal with minorities, and here's some stats. However, some of the people feel like that's not true, and here's the stats from that point of view. And there's been problems in Portland with violence and chaos. And so while some try to distance from that violence, some really actively participate in it, and it's a pretty serious problem. That's kind of just a 30-second neutral, kind of realistic view of things. With the way that it was taught was, this is an angelic organization. Police are the enemy. They target minorities specifically to kill them and oppress them, and again, police are a disaster in Portland. It is a peaceful movement. The people who are causing the damage in Portland are not actually BLM or Antifa. It's actually white supremacists that are masquerading as protesters, and it was basically a complete whitewashing of the whole movement. And what came out of it was, again, the police are the enemy. This movement is angelic, and the only violence is being caused by white supremacists. Nothing from that. So it just came out like I said, what an activist would be teaching my kids, not what an educator is supposed to be doing. And that was just one little thing. Again, there's this whole aspect of this string of Western ideas and philosophy and culture is the enemy. So America is bad. Other cultures are victims of our oppression. And there's this whole narrative that's going on there. And while some of that, again, I think we should teach our kids the truth of some of the bad things that even we as a society have done. There's this constant drumbeat of Western society is evil and oppresses the rest of the world, and that's a very activist viewpoint.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for scaring us. We parents listening tonight. All right, so Paul's got a question for you. He's been patiently waiting. His question is this: in respect to inoculation, what would you want someone to know about Scripture if confronted by someone like a Bart Ehrman?
Can you say it in regards to, what was the first word? Inoculation?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question again?
You bet. In respect to inoculation, what would you want someone to know about Scripture if confronted by someone like Bart Ehrman?
So I'm assuming that inoculation means in order to kind of prep them for confronting or facing the ideas of Bart Ehrman.
Yes.
So I can take that as well. Just a quick rehash. Bart Ehrman wrote some books lately. So he's a scholar he's a New Testament scholar, and he used to be a Christian. He now writes about the fact that the New Testament is not reliable. His ideas are that it was written much later than we initially think it was. It was written by people who didn't know Jesus. It's been mistranslated. The authors who we think are the authors of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, and so on, are not really the authors. At least in some cases, Matthew, Mark, and John specifically. And so he's not a nobody. He knows what he's talking about. He's got powerful arguments. He's not like he's not a bitter, angry, atheist that just likes to throw ad hominem attacks. So he's got some pretty he's a formidable writer. So from a point of view of inoculation, in fact, I'm actually discussing with a friend of mine who's an atheist who's read Bart Ehrman, and he's kind of feeding me a lot of these arguments that the New Testament was written, for example, his opinion is the New Testament was written like 200 AD by people who didn't even live in the time and place that they were supposedly writing about. And again, this is more of a wonky kind of discussion. You're going to really have to dig into the manuscripts and the evidence for why we actually believe that they were eyewitness accounts written no later than about 60 to 70 AD. And let me give just a very quick reasons to believe that Bart Ehrman is wrong about when the New Testament was written. Because if it was written late, then obviously they're unreliable. If it's written during this time, it's at least, plausibly reliable. And one of the major reasons that people believe and I'm not kidding about this. One of the reasons that people, skeptics, think that the Bible, the New Testament, was written much later than we think it was because of a verse in Mark. In Mark, Jesus is walking through next to the temple, and he says, "You see these stones? When not one stone will be left on another." And skeptics will look at that verse and say, well, if that was written before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, that would mean that's a proof positive of a fulfilled prophecy. And we know fulfilled prophecies are not a thing. So it must have been written after the destruction of the temple, which is a kind of a bias against this idea that miracles can't happen. Jesus wasn't a person. But in fact, what we say is, look, it's pretty clear that the New Testament was written pretty early, because one, it was never mentions the destruction of the temple. Nowhere in the New Testament does it mention that, which means that in most cases, writing about these things must have been written before 70 AD. Another example, Luke in the book of Acts does not mention the death of Paul, who died in 65 AD. So there's numerous indicators that show the early, that the Gospels were written early, that the whole New Testament must have been finished before, or at least in most of the books in the New Testament, finished before 70 AD. So just a few quick things. If you want to be inoculated, what you want to read is a book called Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, who talks about the New Testament and the reliability and so on. He addresses some of Bart Ehrman's issues. And we just lost Brian there.
Yeah, I would say, Paul, that's a great question. A couple of thoughts. Adrian, are you done? I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I'm done.
A couple of things. Always look for presuppositions or basis assumptions that are driving what people are thinking. So Adrian just gave a perfect example. If you read a lot of Bart Ehrman and a lot of, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, a lot of people make a base assumption that they don't back up, that there cannot be a supernatural. So they're like, everybody knows that miracles can't happen. Everybody knows that there is no supernatural. Everybody knows. And then they take that one assumption that they never prove, and they actually contradict by using logic and thought anyway, but that's another question. They believe in supernatural. They're just being inconsistent in their application. And then they base this entire argument on this faulty assumption. So again, day in and day out, I run and review hundreds, thousands of experiments in my career as an engineer. And all of those of you who have that kind of a technical background, when you're forming a hypothesis, when you're testing the hypothesis, it only takes one bad assumption for everything to go wrong. You make one bad assumption and then 1,000 good assumptions and 1,000 good measurements and 1,000 good observations. That one faulty assumption can tank everything. And so I think as Christians, again, it gets back to Romans 12:2. When we're saved and God makes us into a new creation, he changes the way we think. And I think we need to allow God's work in our mind. And one of the best things we can do is we can look for falsehoods. We can look for faulty assumptions that people make, one little small one here, and then they jump to all these other things. And if we can catch that in the beginning, we can avoid a lot of wasted time. So I thought that was a good thing you pointed out, Adrian, is a lot of atheists make an unfounded assumption that there is no supernatural, and then everything flows from there. One last thing on your question, Paul. Well, one more comment too before I get to the last thing. I think a lot of times as Christians, we think that every coworker, family member, person that we meet is a Bart Ehrman with a PhD and a postdoc and 40 years of experience in New Testament textual criticism. That's just not the case. And so a lot of times we overestimate our opponent, and they don't know what they're talking about either. They're just they're just regurgitating something they read on an internet post or whatever. So a lot of times it's not your job to be the equivalent of Bart Ehrman on the Christian side. You just need to ask questions of the person that you're talking to and say, well, why do you think that? And they might say, you know what, I haven't thought about it at all. So that rather than you missing the conversation, like I talked with Catherine earlier, you need to know the person that you're talking to and listen to them and engage with them at that level. And 99% of the time, they're not Bart Ehrman. They're just a person who read something and they think they gotcha. So be careful with that too. You can spend a lot of time off on the wrong track. And then the last thing I'll say on this is a lot of times we kind of skip to chapter 4 or chapter 12 or whatever in the story. A lot of times you can go back and say, you know what, Bart Ehrman, let's not worry about the, you know, if I was talking with Bart Ehrman, I would say, you know what, let's not worry about the New Testament yet, because the New Testament is founded on the Old Testament. So let's start where the New Testament starts, which is at the Old Testament. What does the Old Testament start with? It starts with, where did everything come from? So Bart, before we can have any kind of conversation at all, where do you think everything comes from? And you can steer it back to some fundamental assumption that everybody has to make when they make any kind of argument or any kind of assumption, and then you actually have a good conversation, and now you're up and going again. So that can be a way to help them actually have a productive conversation and think through things that they're skipping over, and help both of you arrive at the truth.
Let me say one more thing about this, and that's about that first part of the question about the inoculation. I think that there's if some of you on the call right now never heard of Bart Ehrman or the idea that there's people who claim that the New Testament wasn't even written by the authors we claim that they're written by, and that they were written 200 years, 300 years after the fact. If you have heard that, have your kids heard that? Because at some point, even if you're right, even if they don't confront Bart Ehrman himself, or at some point, a Christian may encounter these arguments, these thoughts, and if they haven't heard them if they haven't been taught how to be ready for these questions, or at least be ready to approach questions they've never heard before, it'll be a shocking thing when they run into this. It'll be shocking. In fact, Bart Ehrman tells his own story. The way he left the faith, he actually went to a famous Christian university. I can't remember the name of it. But he went and he discovered that there are tons of textual variations as a Christian. This is something that he learned as a Christian. There's all these textual variations and in the different manuscripts that we find. And the Bible is pieced together by experts who try their best to figure out what the original said. But there are some passages that they're tough to really get the exact wording, because you'll find 2 or 3 different manuscripts. They're written differently. And so we do our best to recreate what the Bible said. He discovered this, and it was so shocking to him that we didn't have the exact words that were written by Moses himself, that it began his journey of leaving the faith. And so this is why, to me, apologetics is so incredibly important, that you at least touch these subjects. You know that these are out there. You know where to find answers. Because when you or your kids, and again, more likely the younger generation, run into this stuff online, there's gobs of these arguments flying around. Most of them are awful arguments, but it'll hit people. And suddenly one of them will stick because they haven't been prepped. They haven't been inoculated. So we got to do our job as Christians to do that with our kids, with the youth group, with people in the church. We got to do this.
Okay. Let me jump in with one more thing on that, Brian. And I know I want to get to all the other questions. So admittedly, everybody, I'm not going to do a full answer here, but I just want to point something out. Like Adrian said, a lot of people, when they find out that there's textual variations, and if you don't know what that means, write it down, Google it afterwards. I'm not going to explain it right now. What you find is there's a lot of textual variations in the New Testament, especially, and that is actually evidence that the Bible is the word of God. And so go look that up. There's a bunch of people who have done a fantastic job. And when you think about it, you're like, oh, that actually makes sense. The example is there are no textual variations in the Quran. Well, very few anyway, that people know of. What that points back to is a manipulation of the early text of the Quran, which is when you study Islam, you find out, yeah, one of the guys early on was like, there's a whole bunch of variations in the Quran. He burned all of them and said, this is the only one that we're going to have. That's actually a disservice to the credibility of the book. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. If you've never heard that argument before, write it down. We're not going to spend a lot of time here. We could do a whole 45-minute presentation on it, but textual variations can actually result in more credibility of an ancient work. So write that down, Google it.
Cool, very cool. And real quickly, I mean, maybe I'm the only one that got excited about this, but Adrian mentioned this book, and I was like, I've got that book.
Yes.
So anyway, if you don't have this book, I mean, I feel like I'm like stumping for this book, like I get a royalty. But anyway, great book, J. Warner Waltz. Okay, a question about COVID-19 is on the way, but first, a question here for you both. How do you suggest approaching a church or a parachurch organization that is teaching elements of CRT, critical race theory, or social justice?
Okay, so we had a talk. Did you say that person's name, or it was anonymous?
Anonymous.
Okay. We did an entire presentation on this we had someone do a presentation on this. His name was Neil Shenvi. He took so we have on our website, Neil Shenvi's talk. If you need help navigating to the exact link, send us a text or a chat or info@ambassadorsforum.com, and we'll help you get there. Neil Shenvi is one of the leading thinkers on critical race theory in the world today. He did a fantastic presentation in this Friday forum 3 or 4 months ago. We'll give you a link to his entire presentation. And someone asked this exact question, and so I could try and regurgitate it here, and maybe I'll just give you a teaser. But if you want to hear the expert answer that exact question, go find the link for Neil Shenvi. Basically, what he said was this, and this will just be a quick teaser. Go have a conversation. Don't just assume, oh my goodness, my pastor said white fragility, or my pastor said white supremacy, or my pastor said critical race theory. He's like, nobody 95% of the people in America don't even know what that means. So go to that person and say, hey, again, just like all of apologetics, start with a conversation and say, hey, on your sermon last week, I noticed you said blah, 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 blah. What do you think, what do those words mean to you? What did you mean by that phrase? And so that is the best place to start, because most of the time they'll say, I meant this. And you're like, oh, okay. That's not what other people mean by that phrase. And then you're in a conversation rather than getting all up in arms and saying, oh no, my church has bought into critical race theory. Hold on. Whoa, stop, slow down. Go start with a conversation. Anyway, for the whole thing, maybe we can provide a link.
Adrian, anything on that?
I cannot top Neil Shenvi, so have the final word.
Stay in your lane. Is that what you're saying? Okay, let's tackle COVID-19 and the government. So the question goes like this: the government is limiting church attendance. I understand how harmful, potentially deadly COVID can be. In your opinion, what's the balance between following government mandates out of Romans 13, for example, and not forsaking the gathering for the purpose of fellowship, love, and good works and encouragement? So what's the balance between following the government mandate and not being together?
So I'm going to go back to those of you who may know Michael Ferris. He's a very prominent Christian lawyer. He's founded maybe Herb can help me out here, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And I think right now he's the leader of Alliance Defending Freedom. Very amazing guy. I remember watching a talk he was giving on the founding of the United States. And he was saying, hey, at some point back then, Christians participated in a revolution. So what's the deal with that? Like Romans 13, why didn't they just buckle down and say, if the, you always obey the government no matter what. We never would have had a revolution if all the Christians in America in 1774 would have just obeyed that verse. And what I remember him saying was, when a government breaks its own rules, it fails to be a sanctioned government. And so it wasn't that the government was doing bad things. All governments do bad things. It was that they were breaking their own rules. So as an example, and again, I am not the world's expert on this, but if the government right now is following its own rules in enacting, COVID restrictions and so forth, that would be one thing. But if you look into it, and again, Herb Gray has done a great job explaining some of these things in our newsletters. If you aren't on our newsletters, you need to be on our newsletters. We have a legal corner every month that Herb does a fantastic job explaining a lot of these things. What you'll find, if you dig into it, what you'll find is our government is actually kind of bending the rules. And they were, as an example, they were saying, hey, you can go to a liquor store. Liquor stores can stay open, but we need to close down churches. You can have a 10,000 person riot and burn down government buildings in Portland, but you can't have a 50-person church service. So this wasn't a government acting consistent with itself. It was breaking its own rules. Now, I'm not going to say, should we all wear masks? Absolutely. Should we all be safe? Absolutely. Should we follow rules that keep us, stop the spread of the virus? Absolutely. But there are other things that are going on. When a government breaks its own rules, all of us should be paying very close attention.
Okay, real quickly, Adrian, before you jump in, the follow-up to your answer, what about the Constitution? This person says there was no Constitution in 1774.
Correct. So in 1774, people said, hey, the government wasn't the United States government because the United States didn't exist. So they said, our government is King George. And even King George, he was not the, whatever emperor where he could make up his own rules. Even he was subject to his own rules. And so what they said, the Declaration of Independence basically said, look, King George, you are breaking your rules. We've got to do something about this. That was the point.
And maybe I'd modify that just slightly, and that's a government can be following its own rules and yet still be bad. I mean, if one of my favorite things to read was Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, where he was involved in civil disobedience, and a lot of churches were saying you shouldn't be doing this because we should obey the government. And Martin Luther King's response was, the laws are only laws insofar as they follow the higher law, God's law. A law that doesn't that betrays God's law is not a law. We are actually bound in a way to break it because of that. And so there, yeah. So with regard to this, having the government deny the right to assemble and to meet as a church, so we are left with the only question is it wise to meet as a church? Not does the government tell us we can't meet? Because if the government for no reason other than anti-Christian bigotry decides you can't meet as a church, we as Christians ought to say, well, I'm sorry, we're going to meet, and if it means persecution, it means persecution. Now, if they've got a good reason, let's say people will die from COVID. Now, I think that's up to us now to say, okay, we need to protect the vulnerable in our church. Let us make sure that we're not getting people killed. Let us make sure that if there's somebody who is, and this is, again, these are controversial subjects. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert on the subject. I just know that looking at stats, I think there are people who are very vulnerable to this, and they ought not be in close quarters with other people. And there are some people who are not vulnerable at all. And it'll simply be a minor cold. So again, this is a job for I think, again, leaders in the church to get together and say, okay, how can we protect our people and still be and still meet? But if the government tells me I can't meet, my answer is no. That's up to my God my God's law is above man's law, and that's what we'll follow.
And my point, good answer, Adrian. My point was, to me, that's the second phase. So if you have a government that's obeying their own laws and they say, we're obeying our laws, we passed legislation, we did this the right way, and this is what we want you to do. Then you have Acts 4:19, where they pulled in Peter and John. Yeah, Peter and John, and they said, stop preaching the gospel. And in Acts 4:19, they said, hey, whether we should obey you or God, you be the judge. Meaning, I have to obey God first. So if the government even following their own rules, explicitly says you have to do something that's disobedient to God, that to me is a phase 2. My point is, there's a step 1, which is if the government's breaking its own rules, you don't even have to go to phase 2 yet. And so an example that I heard, which I thought was very helpful, for people who say, the Bible says you should always obey the government. And they say, okay, let's say that you live in Oregon and you got a citation from a library in Tennessee that says you owe money for your library card in Tennessee. Would you pay the fine? It's the government. You have to always obey the government. Like, no, because I don't live in Tennessee. I don't have a library card in Tennessee. A library in Tennessee can't charge me in Oregon for having a library card. And so you have to start with step 1 always has to be, wait a minute, is the government operating within their own rules to start with? And then you may get to phase 2, which is now, are they telling you to do something that's contrary to God's law? But to me, the first step is always where you start. All right, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, question for both of you. What would you say is the single greatest issue at risk for the Christian faith today?
At risk, meaning, does that mean at risk as in the issue that brings most Christians to doubt their faith, or is that the...
That would be my guess, yeah.
So
go ahead, Adrian.
Well, okay, so I have in my family and friends an unfortunately large amount of people who have left the faith, and so I've got a little bit of a finger on the pulse for this area. I've got again young family members who have left, some of the older ones as well, and there's it's kind of a mix of things. Some people have left because of genuine arguments that said, okay, well, I learned about evolution and that destroyed my faith. Some said I had a problem with some of the verses in the Bible and I never really felt God in my life, and so they left. But if I were to say the thing that most people have initiated that was the things that they were taught in school, the kind of leftist activism, the kind of I have a large chunk, probably a dozen in my that have started down that journey through doubting based on the values taught in schools that were in direct contradiction to what they were taught at home. They were taught traditional values, man and woman marriage, pro-life. They were taught that we're made in the image of God. All these, so certain things that were foundational to the Christian worldview, and what they started learning at school was the direct opposite. So if I were to say what the number one risk is to Christians, is sending kids unprepared into colleges and high schools, and where they will not maybe, but definitely be taught the exact opposite of everything you've been working with them at home. No society has ever worked harder and paid more money to send their children to a place that will actively indoctrinate them against everything they've been taught. So anyway, it's hard to avoid the college university, but gosh darn it, got to get them ready.
Yeah, I would second that, Adrian. I might say it a little bit differently. I think the number one problem that is facing Christians today is that they are not critically thinking through their faith. Somewhere along the way, they bought into this lie that Christianity is just supposed to be all about faith. You're supposed to believe, you're supposed to look at the Bible, and even though it contradicts itself, and even though it doesn't make any sense, you're just supposed to believe it anyway. That's what God wants you to do. That lie, I think, has set so many people up for a disaster. I think, as Christians, we believe the Bible is true. As Christians, we believe that God has revealed his truth to us, and he wants us to know the truth. And so I think if we respond to that by saying, you know what, we're going to think, we're going to discuss, we're going to ask our questions, because that's what the Christian faith should be, then we will be inoculated against that danger, Adrian, where we send our kids off, unprepared into a world that is waiting to devour them, because our kids will be prepared. That every parent should be thinking, and every Christian should be discussing with their family members and their friends, man, we should be thinking through our faith all the time. We should never get complacent and just say, well, who knows? God doesn't want me to know. He just wants me to believe. I don't think that's a good representation of God at all. God wants us to ask our questions. He wants us to discuss. He wants us to pursue the truth, because Christianity has answers.
Thank you, guys. Question for you both is, according to a recent study, and I think this was actually several years ago, that 8 out of 10 high school seniors will lose their faith in college. The question is, how do we then battle against those odds?
Like I was just saying, Brian, I think and I'll piggyback on something that Adrian said earlier. I think every parent should be taking the command in Deuteronomy 6 seriously. We should be discipling our kids all day, every day, whether we sit down, whether we rise up, whether we walk around the path, all the time, we should be engaging with our kids about the truth of Scripture. And this is the part I'll piggyback on with Adrian, I think we should be the ones introducing our kids to these challenges to the faith, not somebody else surprising them. So I've tried to, and I haven't done a perfect job, but I've tried to introduce these challenges to my own kids and say, hey guys, even when they're young, you have to, age appropriate and everything, but you want them to say, you know what? It's a little technical, but let me use the Bart Ehrman one. Hey kids, did you guys know that there's textual variations in the Bible? Oh, really? No, I don't even know what that means. Okay, well, this is what it means. This is why, this is how you wrestle with this. This is what the impact of this and the consequences. That one's a little technical, maybe not the best example, but you want your kids to hear these arguments from you first, so that when they go to college and someone's like, hey, did you know that, whatever? And they're like, yeah, I heard about that when I was in 3rd grade. That's all you got, really? And that will snuff out a big part of what I think opponents for Christianity have, which is that shock value of, and when I went to MIT, I joined a Christian group when I was a freshman. And again, but I saw it by the time I was a senior, many of my Christian friends had fallen away because they were like, man, nobody ever told me that in church. I lived in a secluded little little bubble. And when I had questions, people were like, hey, don't ask questions. This is church. There's no room for doubts in church. I think that's the worst thing that parents can do. When your kids have questions, encourage them to ask the questions. When your kids have doubt, come alongside them and say, I have doubt too. Let's read the Bible and search this out together. I think that's the best thing that Christian parents can do.
Yeah, actually, I don't have much to add to that other than being deliberate about it. Books, send people to Summit Ministries, week-long apologetics camps. There's things you can do to be deliberate. I've started playing 5-10 minute videos for my kids when we're just sitting around doing nothing else. It's funny how if the choice is go to bed or watch apologetics with daddy, apologetics with daddy. And so there's being deliberate about it, and I think you hit the nail on the head. The shock value is taken away when they've already heard this, and they either have a great answer or at least an answer, so that they can, or at least have heard it, so that they know where to go find information. I think most people here, if they're challenged with something they've never heard that came out of left field, they've heard enough answers to where they're like, okay, I've never heard this. I better go do some research. Not, oh my gosh, I've been lied to. That's the difference in being prepared and never having any preparation whatsoever. If the answer is I've been lied to, that's probably because you never had a proper inoculation.
Yeah. Let me give one example. One of my kids, and again, as an engineer, the topic of science and math and engineering we talk about it every day in my home. And so one of the things that a lot of kids get is, well, didn't you know that science disproved the Bible? And so my kids, I'm like, hey guys, this is what they're going to say. And this is what they mean by it. And this is what they're going to try and do. And so one of my kids is like, hey dad, so-and-so at school was like, well, hey, or maybe it wasn't school, wherever it was. They're like, hey, didn't you know science disproved the Bible? And what my child did was, they didn't say, well, wait a minute, here's this 40-page volume of why that's wrong, and here's all the answers. All they did, it was very simple. They're like, really, can you give me an example? And the person that they were talking to just fell apart because it wasn't a real challenge. They just read something on the internet and they're like, oh, science disproved the Bible. I'm going to get some Christian with that. Well, no, it's like the weakest argument ever. It can be destroyed in like 30 seconds. So teach your children to do that. Teach your children to push back a little and just ask a question. And someone's like, hey, didn't you know science disproved the Bible? Oh, really? Can you give me an example? And it just falls apart. So we need to teach our kids to be confident and to ask questions and to push back.
We've got just about 15 minutes left. So if you've got a last minute question, now is a great time to submit it in the live chat. We want to toss it to Bruce on his iPhone, who is unmuted. And Bruce, you've got the floor. What's your question?
I just wanted to go back to the question about what is the big challenge in terms of undermining or discouraging people from their faith. And we both gave a couple answers, but you kept pointing to the culture, to things outside, whether it's a school or what they're teaching, whatever else. And I'm gonna go with Jesus. I think Jesus would say the big problem are the hypocrites within our midst. the self-righteous, and I think this is one of the weaknesses maybe of apologetics that we need to keep in mind, is that we keep thinking logic and, this is all wonderful, but hypocrisy within the church itself, I think there's a need for looking internally at what is happening right within our churches and how it discourages people from believing.
That's a great point, Bruce. The problem is, the fundamental problem everywhere for all time is sin. God has made that very clear. That's always the biggest problem with every culture and every time and every situation. So it gets tough because we know that there are always going to be hypocrites in the church. Always. There always has been, and there always will be. And so we've got to be careful not to let that become an excuse for somebody to say, well, you know what? I'm not going to confront my own sin because I see somebody else sinning. And Jesus was very clear about this. He was like, oh, no, I'm not going to let you off on that excuse. You have sin that you need to deal with. Don't worry about the other guy. I'll take care of that. I'll be the final judge on that. But let's talk about the sin in your life. And Jesus gave so many great examples where he challenged people and said, and Paul did it again in Romans. People have enough information. They have enough information from the way God created. They have enough information from the conscience that he put on every single person. He wrote his law on their hearts in Romans chapter 1. And he said, so that they are without excuse. They can't use the excuse of hypocrisy in the church. They can't use the excuse of somebody else being sinful. Everybody has to deal with their own sin at some point because they're going to stand before God who judges them.
Jump into that as well. I appreciate what you said, Bruce, because you're right. Apologetics is not a cure-all, and so many people, you're right, will be turned off by the church because of hypocrites and so on. And like Roy said, I think maybe to misquote Jesus, the hypocrites will always be with us, and it reminds me of why I appreciate apologetics from my own personal experience. I was raised with a kind of almost an idolatry of certain church leaders, certain famous pastors, and so on. And I remember I had 3 of them that I just followed religiously. I mean, wherever they went, if they visited town, I would go see them. Whatever videos they put out, I'd watch them. I'd memorized some of these guys. And it turned out that when I was about 19, 20 years old, that 2 of the 3 in succession came crashing down because of personal flaws they had as people. So my idols suddenly were exposed to be hypocrites, and it in some sense it shook my faith because of that. But yet I had started my journey through becoming a Christian, not because of their particular Christianity, but because of it became my own, and I had reasons for my Christianity. It was the apologetics I had started studying. It was my own personal experience with Jesus. It was my own Christianity had started becoming my own, and part of that was through apologetics. And so as a result, my faith I did not stumble in my faith because I no longer had my trust in men in that sense. So I've been grateful to God for leading me down the path of reason in that sense, because now with my reason, I understand that because there's a hypocrite in the church doesn't impact the reality of Christ, the reality of the things he's done for us. So, but yeah, you're absolutely right, Bruce. That's going to be a major cause for people's stumbling.
Okay, want to in these last couple of minutes, want to just kind of, gentlemen, if you can, as best you can, rapid fire these so we can get through these last couple. So in your head, just think, not what a preacher would do. So the question would be, I have a gay friend. Is that possible to have a friend, a gay Christian friend? Is it possible to have a friend who is a gay and also Christian? Is that possible?
Absolutely. So it has to do with your definition of gay. So if gay means they're attracted, they have a sexual attraction to the same sex, of course you can have a gay Christian. You can have somebody who struggles with all kinds of sins. When I was first saved, I was an alcoholic Christian. I was absolutely enslaved to alcohol. And when I became a Christian, God didn't just remove that temptation right away. It's something that I struggled with for a long time. And so depending on how you define that word gay, if it's someone who's attracted to the same sex, absolutely. You could be a Christian and be attracted to the same sex.
Adrian, anything?
It means the question is, can you have a Christian? Can someone be a Christian who sins? Absolutely. So, sinning that way is the question is whether or not they have repented and are putting their trust in Christ and as a result, Christ is working them in this area among many other areas. So there's nothing super special about this one thing that disqualifies you.
Next question. I work in a highly sensitive work culture. I struggle with calling transgendered people by their preferred pronouns. What do I do?
To me, this all comes down to the relationship that you have with that person. So if you have a very strong relationship with them, you gave the example of a work environment. Maybe you don't have a very strong relationship with them. I think coming in, dumping your Bible saying, I'm going to call you what God tells me to call you, and I don't care about you, and I don't respect you. You're not going to win any friends, and you're certainly, in my opinion, you're not going to represent God well. So I would say, if you don't have any relationship with someone, do you want to try and pick a fight with them and say, wait a minute, I'm not going to call you by your preferred pronoun. I'm going to be disrespectful to you and in your face, even though I don't know you. Doesn't seem like a very good approach to me. Now, what about someone in your family, a brother or sister, an aunt or uncle, whatever? That's a different conversation. And that's a much longer conversation than just some little thing, what you call them in a public meeting or something like that, my opinion.
Yeah, this is absolutely a tough one because in many cases, it's a choice between calling them their preferred pronoun or not having a relationship with them at all. And so you've got to, on the other hand, calling them by the preferred pronoun means that you're starting to participate in this, in a part of culture that you are against. So now you're perpetuating an idea that you don't agree with. So you're forced to either perpetuate an idea you don't agree with or lose a relationship with these people. And so you have to decide which is more important, hopefully trying to explain to that those individuals that, you love them and whatever you choose. In fact, this came up in my own family with an individual where we had to explain, regardless of what we choose, no, we love you and we hope we don't lose our relationship with you. So it's a tough one. You're forced into a binary choice.
Okay, I've got a final question for you two real quickly for everyone watching, the nearly 40 of you. December 18th will be the next Friday forum, the next virtual Friday forum. And Dr. Stephen Van Horn will be speaking, sharing and answering your questions at the end of his talk. Titled, Is Anyone Asking You? Really diving into 1 Peter and looking at the persecution that comes with being a Christ follower, the expectation of that. So again, that's coming up December 18th on a Friday night. So what a great way. You've been crazy shopping for Christmas, and Stephen will be here just to calm you down on a couple days before Christmas. Final question goes like this, gentlemen. It says, in this hypersensitive election this year, which doesn't seem to be over, I'm wondering, do you think Jesus was political?
I'm gonna let you kick that one off, Roy.
Is this thing on?
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna just go for it. You know you can't shepherd hook me out of the way because this is the last question. So I'm gonna let it all hang out. Absolutely, I absolutely think Jesus was political, and I think that when Christians say Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, I think that's shameful. I think it's shameful. Christians should absolutely be involved in politics. Christians should absolutely bring the truth of God and apply the truth of God in our culture, in the marketplace, in politics, everywhere. We should bring Jesus and the truth of Scripture everywhere we go, including politics. And I think Jesus did, and I could give you 20 examples in Scripture of where I think Jesus was very political. How's that?
Stop being around the bush so much. I felt like I fully agree. Jesus was political, and he wasn't, but because he didn't address certain issues doesn't mean he didn't address any issues. So his goal wasn't always to fix the Roman rule of Israel. That wasn't part of his goal. He addressed the issues of his time in the manner that he needed to. So we are to, I think, do the exact same way. We are to address the issues that we can grapple with. Some of us are going to be addressing a limited number of issues, and we have a limited amount of time. To ignore politics is to basically give up the culture and give up if Christians who back out are basically saying, have at it to the world to influence my life, my family, and everything that impacts my church. And I'm going to simply wash my hands of it and say, Jesus wasn't political. So, and when things go badly, you're now, you hold up your hands and say that it was not my fault. If we as Christians do not get engaged, and more than we are now, we're going to lose the culture in a way that's. Let me give you an example. Again, I'm going to go back to this issue with my kids are in school right now being taught. My kids are being indoctrinated. Now they are lucky because they're at home and we hear them, and I get to counteract them. But their classmates and 30 million other kids are being indoctrinated right now, and you have no influence over it until you start getting political. So, yes, as a Christian, it's definitely our duty. So that's my.
Hey, Brian, I know we're a little over, but let me just end with this. I would like to, I don't know who asked that question. Maybe they asked it on behalf of several of you. I would like to personally challenge all of you. If you have a different opinion, so I've read the Bible, I've thought and studied my guts out on so many topics, but I'm not always right. And so I'm open to the fact that I might be wrong on this. I would love anybody on the call right now, and you text us, I'll give you my personal email. If you would like to engage in a discussion and your position is, I think the Bible says Christians should not be involved in politics, I would love to hear your argument. I've never heard a good argument for that. If you can and again, not to be rude, I don't care what your opinion is. If you can back it up and you can make a scriptural, biblical argument that Christians should not be involved in politics, I would love to hear it. You can have my personal email.
Okay. For some reason, I thought I heard personal address, and I was like, don't give away your home address. Okay, so if you'd like to take that, so Roy, how are they going to, do they just email at the Ambassadors Forum website or what?
Text me right now. I'm on the text chat, so send me a private message right now and say, hi, Roy, what's your personal email? And I'll chat it back to you right now.
Okay. Roy and Adrian, thank you so much for great answers tonight. And don't forget, everybody, December 18th, Dr. Stephen Van Horn will join us live here on the Friday Forum. Roy, Adrian, to everyone else, good night, and we'll see you in December.
See you there.